Ladies and gentlemen, this unfortunately is the second year in succession in which, for obvious reasons, I've had to address you virtually rather than in person. I suppose, therefore, that it's only appropriate that I should talk about some of the ethical and philosophical questions that this episode in world history, which is far from over, of course, has thrown up. Perhaps I should say that it would be appropriate if I had the answers to the question myself, but I don't. The current situation brings to mind the now much hackneyed words of W.B. Yeats, that the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. Part of the problem, of course, is that there is little agreement even over the best way to have dealt with the pandemic. And we still don't know what the best way would have been or what it is now, or even how serious the epidemic was in purely medical terms. For example, the loss of life in absolute numbers is still probably no higher than that of the Asian and Hong Kong influenza epidemics of 1958 and 1968, respectively, when the world population was only a half or two-thirds of what it is now, and which really left very little historical or cultural trace, even in the memories of those who lived through them. But of course, if the measures taken in most countries during the COVID epidemic limited the number of deaths, which some of course dispute, then these comparisons that are used to downplay the significance of the COVID-19 epidemic in purely medical terms are misleading. There are many other difficulties, of course. The absolute number of deaths and the death rates are not the only statistics to be considered. There's also the question of the number of life years lost. It rapidly became clear during this epidemic that the risk of death from disease rose exponentially with age. The number of life years lost in a child, if a child of 5 dies, is rather more than 75. The number of life years lost if someone dies aged 85 is 6. Probably less, in that the 85-year-old who actually dies is probably an 85-year-old with a less than average life expectancy, less than median life expectancy of his age group. In other words, one death at the age of 5 is, from the point of view of life years lost, equal to more than 12 deaths of 85-year-olds. If we take life years lost into account, we might say that the COVID epidemic was considerably less serious than the Asian and Hong Kong flu that I've just mentioned, because the latter killed far younger people. But there's something deeply disturbing about this way of approaching the epidemic, for it comes close to saying that the life of an 85-year-old is worth less than the life of someone younger. That is to say, a murder of an 85-year-old is a lesser crime than that of a child. And we already live in an age in which compulsory euthanasia is conceivable. And where the Netherlands leads, can the rest of Europe be far behind? An item in the New England Journal of Medicine reporting in 2017 on the latest figures for euthanasia in the Netherlands said that 92% of those euthanized had serious illnesses, which of course raises the interesting question of what the other 8% had, and they were about 400, I beg your pardon. This was a question that escaped the editor's notice. That was very significant, as did the fact that the notion of serious illness is a very movable feast, to say the least. Not all serious illness is fatal, and quite a lot is curable. In a world in which one of the most important medical journals in the world overlooks these fairly obvious considerations, it would not be altogether reassuring to be ill if analysis by life years saved were always uppermost in doctors and in particular in bureaucrats' minds. On the other hand, and there is always another hand, the lockdowns were instituted largely to save the lives of the elderly, given that it was they who were dying. I'm not qualified to go into the question of the efficacy of the lockdowns, but the major justification for them was to prevent the hospitals being overwhelmed with patients seriously ill with COVID, given that no government could admit that it had no intention of saving the lives of those who were ill, even if they were 85, it was inevitable, perhaps, that there would be lockdowns. Of course, the economic devastation caused by the lockdowns was enormous, and the consequences are likely to be considerable and lasting. Likely, I should point out, not certain, and not the same for everyone, so that anyone who confidently proposes a particular cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns or anything else in this situation is, I think, being overconfident. I am reminded of what an American economist told the BBC when asked what the effects of the 2008 financial crisis would be. He said that there might be a recession or there might not, but if there were, it might be long or it might be short, and it might be deep or it might be shallow. I think I could have worked that out for myself. There's an inherent problem with utilitarian cost-benefit analyses in a situation like this in any case. The costs and the benefits are incommensurable, for there's no common unit of measurement between them. This is a fundamental problem, of course, with utilitarianism as an ethical theory. If I say that I think it is worth suffering a 10% fall in GDP and many years of indebtedness to save 5,000 85-year-olds, and you say that it is not, there is no way of resolving this disagreement. And if in the attempt to make the two sides of the cost-benefit analysis commensurable, at least to a degree, you say that the economic loss caused by lockdown will itself cause a loss of life, I would be able to reply that you cannot possibly know this, at least with any degree of certainty, because predictions in this field are so unreliable. It was, for example, confidently predicted that the suicide rate would go up during lockdowns, and it did not go up during lockdowns, though it's still possible that different people were committing suicide. So when you make a prediction, you might be right or you might be wrong. Another vexed question relates to immunization, usually called vaccination. Should it be compulsory in any, in all, or in some circumstances? In practice, this is tied up psychologically, if not logically, with ideas about the efficacy, side effects, and so forth of the vaccines. We may think that our present dilemmas are unprecedented, but actually they are not. Let me refer, for example, to an item in the British Medical Journal from 1962. In those days, doctors advised people, especially children, that they should be vaccinated, as indeed I was. It was not compulsory except for travellers. How well I remember the yellowish international forms that you had to show at borders and immigration desks. But in those days, of course, in 1962, what the doctor advised was more or less accepted on trust, at least by most people. So most people did get vaccinated, most children were vaccinated. The questioner in the British Medical Journal, who was anonymous but almost certainly a family doctor, asked whether doctors should still be recommending that people were vaccinated against smallpox, given that deaths from the complications of smallpox vaccination were more frequent than deaths from smallpox in the country. You might be interested to know that as late as 1972 or 3, as a medical student, I saw a case of a disease called eczema vaccinatum, in which someone with eczema had wrongly been vaccinated and now suffered from generalized vaccinia disease, from which he was likely to die. The expert, if anonymous, answer given to the questioner did not dispute the fact that more people died in Britain from the consequences of vaccination than from the disease it was supposed to protect against, but this was because the rate of vaccination had been kept up, and in the opinion of the expert should continue to be kept up. True enough, it did not require that everyone should be vaccinated for vaccination to intercept the transmission of smallpox. But on what basis could doctors recommend, when dealing with patients, that 8 out of 10 of them should be vaccinated? And how were they to distinguish the 8 from the 2? In other words, in any individual case, the doctors, were recommending vaccination not for the good of the individual, for he was more likely to suffer than benefit from it himself. That is, unless there were an outbreak of smallpox close by, but for the good of the collective. No doubt many young people today are reluctant to take the vaccine precisely for this reason. They might or might not be statistically correct, though the difference in likelihood of harms between having the vaccine and the harms done by the vaccine themselves vanishingly small by comparison with the other risks that they take when they go bicycling, driving or clubbing. But of course it's up to them to decide which risks they want to take and which they don't, if that is, they alone take the consequences of their choices. The statistics of COVID-19, which people now look at like investors who are worried about the movement of bonds and the stock market, are extremely difficult to interpret, though they have a tendency to solidify in our minds so that they must reflect real differences. Few people looking at the figures think about the margin of error, for example, which may be so great as to vitiate any possible meaning of at least some comparisons. Different jurisdictions may use different classificatory criteria and may be very different in the thoroughness of their ascertainment of the causes of death. But even if differences are real, they don't tell us in any straightforward way about the success or failure of different policies. The density of population and its age structure, the frequency of multi-generational households, the percentage of fat people and diabetics, and many other factors would have to be taken into account, and to do so is likely to prove to be a labour of Hercules. Policy differences between different countries may be small or large, but it will be no easy matter to distinguish precisely what aspect of policy made a difference, for good or evil. We have to act in the absence of perfect knowledge, however. In a crisis, there's always a bias to do something rather than to do nothing. If you do nothing and things turn out badly, you will be blamed for doing nothing. If you do something, especially drastic, you can say you did your best and things would have been worse if you hadn't done those things. The collateral costs of doing something are likely to fall mainly on your successors in any case. Thus, plausible measures will usually be taken in advance of evidence that they work. But plausibility is a very poor guide to efficacy. Here it might be worth returning to the history of smallpox vaccination, a history which itself is still highly contested, though one fact stands out, that the world has been rid of this disease, if not quite of the virus that causes it, because it's still preserved in at least 2 locations. If it were to leak from them, the havoc would be incalculable, for we no longer have the vaccine or immunity against the disease. Incidentally, you might be interested to know that the President of the Royal Society, the elite organisation of British scientists, many years ago predicted that a virological laboratory accident would kill 1 million people by the year 2020. A lucky hit? Whether it was a hit at all depends on the source of the COVID-19 virus, which may never be known for certain. From the very first, the use of immunization as a method has aroused widespread hostility. People said that there was no explanation of how it worked, if it did work, that is, which was often denied. This, of course, was perfectly true at the time. No one knew how it worked, but this is an irrelevant objection. It was mainly after vaccination was made compulsory in England, however, that opposition to it became not merely an intellectual matter, but the basis of a very powerful social movement, one of the strongest of the second half of the 19th and the first third of the 20th centuries. Even when the government granted concessions to the anti-vaccination movement, which incidentally crossed class lines, it did not die down, suggesting that there was something more to the movement than opposition to compulsion. I've a small collection of anti-vaccination literature from the 19th and 20th centuries. This literature was vast and often very detailed. What is interesting is its mixture of statistics with conspiracy theory. It was not enough that vaccination was mistaken as a procedure, and let us remember that the opposition to it was during years in which there were many procedures that from a modern medical standpoint were much more absurd and even dangerous, but that it was morally reprehensible. Vaccination was morally reprehensible. There was an entire historiography attempting to show that Edward Jenner, who the discoverer or inventor of vaccination, whatever you want to call it, was an unmitigated scoundrel and fraud, motivated entirely by fame and money. It's true that Parliament voted him £30,000 for his discovery. In those days, an immense sum of money, equivalent probably to $5 million today. But he could hardly have known in advance that he would be so rewarded, for no one had ever been rewarded in this fashion before. The emotions aroused by the question were strong as those seen on web chats today, and often using the same arguments. Vaccination was long regarded as a fraud kept going by doctors in need of an income. This allegation was repeated as late as 1936 by Joseph P. Swan in his book The Vaccination Question. The worst possible construction was put on vaccinators' intentions and intellect. And incidentally, Swan in his book, and we're talking about 1936, denied that smallpox was actually a distinct disease. Every possible evil was attributed to vaccination, from leprosy to cancer. Fairly typical of this genre of anti-vaccination literature are these words from one John Pickering, whose book Which? Sanitation and Sanitary Remedies, or Vaccination and the Drug Treatment, was published in 1892. There is but one consideration with regard to vaccination before the country, and the point may be put thus. Is the whole nation to submit to a wicked, senseless and useless observance, with no other reason for it in the wide world than this, namely, that the medical men may go on drawing their salaries and fees for performing vaccination? Vaccination was, from its first inception, as in every successive stage, has been promulgated and upheld by an interested physiocracy, by which physiocracy Pickering meant the dictatorship of doctors and medicine. Also, he said, it shall be from this day a warfare carried on by a medical clique in arms against the people and in opposition to the will of the nation expressed in large public meetings. And yet again, there is a widespread feeling of insecurity and doubt, almost amounting to dread, and in individual cases to consternation, about many of the points where medical men have to be resorted to, whether in their professional capacities or their official duties. This all sounds very familiar. The fact is that most anti-vaccinationists were also, in effect, nature-worshipping pagans who believed in nature cures and who, as far as many of their beliefs were concerned, strained at a gnat while swallowing a camel. I've already mentioned Joseph P. Swan, who as late as 1936, as I said, denied that smallpox was a separate disease and claimed that all fevers had the same cause. This is 1936. The Nobel Prize-winning author George Bernard Shaw thought that immunization as a procedure was a fraud and a hoax, and that smallpox vaccination, that was to rid the world of smallpox only 28 years after his death, was no better than injecting people with the sweepings of a dustpan. This is not to say that the concerns of anti-vaccination movements are always entirely without foundation, even if sometimes they are deeply misplaced. They were worried about increasing technocracy, a technocracy which is often without technical competence, imposing its laws with disputable evidence as justification. Also bureaucracy, financial interest and political oligarchy, in the same way that we are worried about all these things. But I personally see no solution to or final assuagement of these anxieties anytime soon.